Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney has been making a bold claim that's spreading across the political landscape like wildfire.
Tariff-free. That's our exports to the United States, that's U.S. exports to Canada. And we recognize that. We recognize very much the United States reaffirmation of this core element of CUSMA, or what they would call USMCA. So it's important to preserve that. It's important to reinforce that. And part of our discussions is about that. We are also very cognizant that in about 9 months from now, the first review of USMCA, CUSMA as we call it, will begin between the three parties. So there's a bigger picture there. The third thing, just from context, is we have always said that we will apply tariffs where they had the maximum impact in the United States and a minimum impact in Canada. And so we don't automatically adjust. We look at what we can do for our industry that's most effective. In some cases, that will be to remove tariffs. We have removed some tariffs over time so that, for example, the auto industry can function more effectively. And we'll look at opportunities to do so, because in the end, we're looking at having the best impact in Canada. The last point, if I may, which is what today is very much about, is we're focused on a positive agenda of building forward for our major industries, those most affected, the softwood lumber industry, clearly, steel, aluminum, other industries as well.
The Prime Minister has repeatedly emphasized that despite President Trump imposing devastating 35% tariffs on Canadian goods, the vast majority of Canada-US trade continues to flow tariff-free. This statistic tells only part of the story, and the reality is far more complex than politicians want you to believe. When Trump cranked up his tariff war machine in 2025, targeting Canada with punishing duties, he wasn't just throwing around random numbers. The 35% tariff represents a massive escalation from the previous 25% rate.
Get an extension, and Canada did not.
Well, I think it's because of the feeling in the room, or the energy in the room when the negotiators are talking to each other. And, so the decision was made by our team, to the president. The president decided, let's give Mexico an extension, put the 35% tariff on Canada. But remember, this is for non-USMCA compliant products. So I've talked to, your ambassador, the U.S. Ambassador Hillman. I think she's characterized Canada's position right now as one that lots of countries around the world would be envious of, because the effective tariff rate for Canada right now on all goods and services going into the U.S. is about 5%. That's not a bad place for Canada to be right now.
So if I understand your answer to that question correctly, you're saying it's the energy in the room is the reason why Canada got hit and Mexico did not?
Well, Canada really, number one, Canada really didn't get hit very hard. Okay?
But still got hit, and Mexico did not.
Mexico did not, and it's, the negotiators, I'm assuming, are sitting in the room and saying, okay, we're making, the negotiations that we're in right now with Mexico and where we believe we are headed.
The U.S. ambassador to Canada himself struggled to explain why Mexico received an extension on trade negotiations while Canada faced immediate tariffs, vaguely attributing it to the energy in the room during negotiations and suggesting negotiators felt they were making more progress with Mexico than with Canada. But Carney's response has been calculated and strategic, backed by a trade agreement that Trump himself negotiated during his first presidency. The Canada-US-Mexico agreement, known as CUSMA, is the key to understanding why Carney can make such a confident claim. This three-way trade deal, which replaced NAFTA during Trump's first term, created a shield that protects the vast majority of Canadian exports from these crushing tariffs. The irony? Trump is now being blocked by his own trade deal. But let's break down what that 85% figure really means. When Carney stands before reporters and declares that 85% of Canadian trade with the U.S. is tariff-free, he's not talking about the current reality. He's talking about potential. That percentage represents Canadian exports that have the potential to qualify for CUSMA exemptions, not necessarily the proportion that's actually using those protections right now. Here's where it gets interesting. U.S. Census Bureau data reveals a starkly different picture. Only about 38% of U.S. imports from Canada were actually traded under CUSMA provisions last year. That's less than half of what Carney's headline number suggests. The Yale Budget Lab, in their analysis published this year, assumed that around 50% of Canada's exports to the U.S. are currently certified under CUSMA, still significantly lower than the 85% political talking point. So what's causing this massive gap between potential and reality? The answer lies in the bureaucratic maze that small and medium-sized businesses face when trying to prove their products qualify for CUSMA protection. Tyler Meredith, a former economic advisor to the Trudeau government and founding partner of Meredith, Bosanquet and Phillips, argues that citing the 85% figure alone actually understates the real costs Canadian businesses are facing under Trump's tariff regime. For a product to qualify for CUSMA exemptions, it must meet strict rules of origin requirements. Generally, 60 to 75% of a good must come from within North America to qualify for tariff-free treatment. But meeting these requirements is just the first hurdle. Companies then face the daunting task of proving compliance through extensive documentation and certification processes. Take the example of a simple screwdriver versus a Canadian steak. If a cow is born, raised, slaughtered, and prepared in Alberta, that steak is clearly Canadian and easily qualifies for CUSMA protection. But that screwdriver? The manufacturer has to trace every component, the metal, the plastic handle, the rubber grip, to ensure enough materials come from Canada, Mexico, or the United States. Then they have to prove they're adding value by converting raw materials into a finished product. Laura Dawson, executive director of the Future Borders Coalition, describes the certification process as painstaking and time-consuming, but says it's becoming the new reality for Canadian exporters who want to do business with the United States. The process is so complex that one trade expert compared it to cryptography. This complexity has led many businesses, particularly smaller ones, to simply avoid the CUSMA certification process altogether. Before Trump's tariffs, Canadian exporters could trade with the U.S. under most favored nation status, which allowed them to trade with very low tariffs, or none at all, without jumping through CUSMA's bureaucratic hoops. All World Trade Organization members, including Canada, have MFN status when trading with each other. But Trump's tariff war changed everything.
Just in the last 3 months, we've seen the U.S. auto industry face $6.2 billion in tariff-related costs, with most of them projecting significantly higher costs for the year. We're looking at 37,000 manufacturing jobs that have disappeared in the U.S., and factory employment is the lowest it's been in 5 years, which is not a good thing. And you see what happens with President Trump. Someone gives them the wrong job numbers that are accurate job numbers, they get fired. Well, President Trump has to realize it's costing companies billions of dollars. So they need to shift and start looking at working collaboratively with us.
The devastating economic impacts are already clear. The U.S. auto industry alone has faced $6.2 billion in tariff-related costs over just 3 months, with 37,000 manufacturing jobs lost and factory employment hitting its lowest point in 5 years. Major companies like Procter & Gamble are facing billion-dollar costs, proving that these tariffs act as a tax on Americans themselves. The 35% tariff that took effect on August 1st created a massive incentive for businesses to either get CUSMA certified or face devastating duties. Dan Kelly, president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, warns that some small and medium-sized businesses facing the 35% tariff may have to stop selling into the United States entirely. The impact isn't just economic, it's reshaping entire business strategies. Meredith notes that faced with higher tariffs, Canadian companies are considering either taking on the costs of certification or looking at markets beyond the U.S. This could fundamentally alter Canada's trade patterns.
Technology, Canadian lumber, and Canadian values. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. In an effort to get to most of our journalists on the line here, we'll do one question, no follow-up. So we'll do about 15 minutes of question. Première question, first question.
Good morning, almost good afternoon, Prime Minister Carney.
Thank you.
My name is Claudia Van Emmerich. I'm with Global News. My question for you is that the Trump administration has increased the general tariff rate as well as double tariffs on steel and aluminum, yet your government has not retaliated. How do you justify it to Canadians who have voted you in to be elbows up against Trump that your government has not fired back, that you have not retaliated? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think the first thing to recognize is, and I said this in my remarks, but I'm going to repeat for emphasis, which is that 85% of the trade between Canada and the United States is tariff-free. That's our exports to the United States, that's U.S. exports to Canada. And we recognize that. We recognize very much the United States reaffirmation of this core element of CUSMA, or what they would call USMCA.
Canada is now shifting from reliance to resilience, building one Canadian economy out of 13 provinces with unprecedented investments in home building, nation-building projects, and trade diversification. The message is clear. Canada is prioritizing Canadian materials, Canadian workers, and Canadian technology in construction projects across the nation. What makes this situation particularly fascinating is how it reveals the limitations of Trump's own negotiating strategy. By creating CUSMA during his first presidency, Trump inadvertently gave Canada a powerful defensive tool. The trade agreement he once praised as a good deal for all countries is now serving as a shield against his own tariff offensive. Experts estimate that anywhere from 80 to 95% of Canadian goods might be able to comply with CUSMA's rules of origin, according to Michael Dobner, the national leader of economics and policy practice at PricewaterhouseCoopers Canada. This means that while Trump's tariffs grab headlines, their actual impact on Canadian trade could be far more limited than the dramatic 35% figure suggests. However, the businesses that do get hit face severe consequences. Electronics and machinery manufacturers in particular tend to have the hardest time getting CUSMA certification because their products often rely on components from outside North America. These sectors, while representing a smaller percentage of overall trade, employ thousands of Canadians and contribute significantly to the economy. Carney's government has responded to these challenges with a multi-pronged approach. They've maintained that Canada will not lift its retaliatory tariffs until all U.S. tariff threats are withdrawn, and they've accused Trump of violating the very trade agreement he signed. The Canadian response has been measured but firm.
Than those retaliatory tariffs. The retaliatory tariffs are an indication of the elbows up strategy engaged with the United States, but those specific tariffs, I mean, we've got a whole lot of issues that are out there. The base level of tariffs that will affect the country. We've got aluminum, steel, copper, auto parts, and those types of things that are going to have a much larger impact moving forward than those retaliatory tariffs. I think they're an irritant right now. I've talked to someone, it's kind of like, yeah, we see what Canada's doing. We see the personal attacks that, certain Canadian politicians are making against. They're very, very cognizant of everything that's going on in this trade realm and these negotiations.
That said, can you understand why in this moment there is the political space, there seems to be public support for Canada to have those elbows up? Can you see why Canadians are angry?
Actually, we've engaged in a strategy, a global strategy, to change how America does trade, all right? Most of these countries have found a way to work with us, to be constructive, and to reach an agreement with us. Canada at this point, they're in some cases they're angry. It is, the government's been very effective at selling the strategy of elbows up. Okay, but America needed to get its house in order, our financial house in order. The president wants prosperity, security, and stability for the American people. Trade was one of the elements that he indicated.
The U.S. ambassador has acknowledged that Canada has taken what he calls an elbows-up strategy, noting that only China and Canada have imposed retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. He characterizes these retaliatory measures as an irritant in negotiations and reveals that the Trump administration is very cognizant of Canada's actions, including what he calls personal attacks from Canadian politicians. The political implications of this trade war extend far beyond economics. Trump's frequent attacks on Canada's sovereignty have infuriated Canadians and led to a surge in Canadian nationalism that has dramatically bolstered Liberal poll numbers. What appeared to be a certain electoral defeat for Carney's party has transformed into a competitive race, with many Canadians rallying behind their government in the face of external pressure. Carney's experience as a former central banker, having navigated the 2008 financial crisis as head of the Bank of Canada and later managing Brexit's impact as governor of the Bank of England, gives him credibility in handling this trade crisis. His calm, diplomatic approach contrasts sharply with Trump's bombastic negotiating style, and many Canadians see him as the steady hand needed to navigate these turbulent waters. But the 85% figure that Carney keeps citing also reveals something important about political messaging in the modern era. In a complex trade dispute with multiple moving parts, politicians need simple, memorable statistics that can cut through the noise. Whether that number represents current reality or future potential becomes secondary to its power as a rallying cry. The real test of Carney's strategy will come in the months ahead. Trump has made it clear that he's prepared to escalate trade tensions further, warning that if Canada raises its own tariffs, whatever the number you choose to raise them by will be added onto the 35% that we charge. This creates a dangerous spiral where both countries could find themselves locked in an increasingly destructive trade war. For Canadian businesses caught in the middle, the message is clear: adapt or face the consequences. Those that can navigate customs certification requirements will find themselves protected from Trump's tariff assault. Those that can't may find themselves priced out of their largest export market or forced to fundamentally restructure their supply chains. The broader lesson from this trade dispute is that in an increasingly interconnected global economy, the details matter enormously. Carney's 85% claim isn't wrong. It accurately describes the potential for Canadian exports to avoid Trump's tariffs. But the gap between potential and reality reveals the real-world challenges that businesses face when politics and economics collide. As this trade war continues to evolve, one thing is certain: the numbers tell only part of the story. Behind every statistic are real businesses, real workers, and real consequences that will shape the future of North American trade for years to come. Carney's confident claim about tariff-free trade may be technically accurate, but the full picture is far more nuanced and far more important than any single percentage can capture. The ultimate irony in all of this? Trump's own trade deal may end up being Canada's best defense against Trump's trade war. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in politics is the one your opponent gave you.